Brothers and sisters in Islam, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وأفضل الصلاة وأتم التسليم على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيبنا محمد وعلى آله الطاهرين ورضوان الله تعالى على صحابات الراشدين والتابعين لهم بخير وإحسان إلى يوم الدين وعلينا معهم برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين وبعد. We welcome you again this evening to our latest session in our series of classes of the history of racism and resistance in America and these United States of America. And for today's class, we will have CAIR Michigan staff attorney Amy Doukoure, who will be talking with us about the history of slave codes in these United States of America. So without any further ado, I bring on my colleague, Sister Amy. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam, Brother Dawood.
And she will take it from here, and I will remove myself from this class, and I'll be watching, and then we will come back on for the I will come back on for the question and answer session of this class.
Assalamu alaikum, everybody. I'm happy to be here today to discuss slave codes with you. This is such an important topic and an important class series. I'm glad that we have the chance to do this, and I'm happy that everybody's tuning in to see what's been taking place. So without further ado, let's get started. So slave codes really are derived primarily around controlling the behavior of the enslaved Africans that came here. And what we know is that the first enslaved Africans arrived in the United States. The first recorded record of that is on August 9th of 1526, when Luis Vasquez de Leon brought 600 colonists with him to the United States. And there was a record that within those 600 colonists, there was also enslaved Africans, but we don't really know how many there were. But we do know that that was the original time that we have a record of enslaved Africans being brought into what became the United States. We also know that the first known English slave code was established in Barbados in 1661, and primarily all of the slave codes that came after that were derived directly from that original code. And we also can see from the timeline that the last known survivor of legalized slavery in the U.S. Did not die until 1972. And what that shows us is that while we think of slavery as having happened a very long time ago for most of us, is that the effects that slavery had and the effects that the codes that governed the behavior of enslaved individuals in the United States had a very long-lasting effect and lasted into well past what we have come to know as the civil rights era of the 1960s and the 1950s. And that's important when we have a discussion currently around systemic racism that's still taking place in America. It's important to understand that the effects of the slave codes is really part of what we're talking about when we talk about systemic racism. And when we look at the last known survivors, so for instance, the last known slave owned by the U.S. president of Andrew Johnson, he visited Franklin Roosevelt in the White House in 1937. 1937 wasn't that long ago, and we can see that they're still visiting. We know that Peter Mills was a slave who was born in October 26 in 1861, and he didn't pass away until 1972. There's other individuals who passed away in 1971, 1970, 1969, 1963. So it's not an anomaly. It's not just one surviving person. These codes had a lasting effect for generations and generations. So that's what this class is really going to talk about. We're going to talk about what the codes were how they governed behavior at the time that they were in effect, and how we will discuss a little bit about how they continue to disenfranchise African Americans for long after slavery existed. So really, what is a slave code? There were many different versions of slave codes, but they all had the same theme, and they were all relating to enslaved people. Most of the codes pertain to the transatlantic slave trade, which is what we come to know as the slave trade that brought the African enslaved Africans to the United States. And they really didn't cover or give any rights to the enslaved individual. And what they really did cover were the rights and the duties of free people or the slave owners with regards to the enslaved person. They were not unique to the American colonies, but they were in the United States from at least 1865. It wasn't just the English who had slave codes. The French also had their own codes that they were known as Code Noir, and the Spanish had codes called Las Siete Partidas, which pertained to the enslaved Africans that were being held by the Spanish. Each individual colony had their own slave code. Most of them were based off of Barbados, or they were based off of the Virginia slave code that was enacted first in Virginia. But the Virginia slave code is also known to be highly representative of what was taking place in Barbados. There was no set standard of slave codes, and the laws varied from state to state and even from city to city. Municipalities throughout the colonies had their own codes. And so the movement of slaves and the behavior of slaves was really regulated, not just by the states, but also by individual municipalities. When the English colonies, when they gained their independence from Great Britain and they became the United States, each state made its own constitution and also codified its own laws. And those laws often included the slave codes. However, at that time, there was still no universal law about enslaved person. Inherent in the idea of the slave codes was the idea that enslaved Africans were not persons, but they were property. And the laws were developed around protecting the slave owner's property, and also to protect slave owners from violence or uprising or insurrection, or really from enslaved persons trying to free themselves. And then slave codes were really drawn very strictly along color lines. So it didn't matter really how much African heritage you had in you. If you had any African heritage, you were considered to be Black. And regardless of whether you were an enslaved person or a free person, these slave codes pertain to you if you had any amount of African blood in you. It's also important to know, one of the things that gets lost from time to time in the history and the telling of our slave history in the United States is that actually indigenous persons were enslaved. Indigenous persons were enslaved specifically in Florida and Carolina. And in the Carolinas, indigenous people made up almost a quarter of the entire enslaved population. That's a very large number of persons to have been enslaved. And we know that these codes, while they were primarily for Black enslaved persons, they also were used for indigenous persons as well. So they were subjected to all of the same codes and laws that enslaved Africans were. Slave codes are really the forerunners of what became known as the Black codes of the early 19th century. And the Black codes were numerous laws that were enacted after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1865 and 1866 in the former states of the Confederacy. They were enacted after the American Civil War, and the Black codes were really intended to assure the continuance of white supremacy. And they were enacted with the express intent to keep in place the social controls that slavery had undergone, and were then removed by the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. So after the slave codes, we come directly into the period of the Black Codes, which intended to keep in place all of the disenfranchisement that happened under the slave codes for the benefit of the white slave owning class. And what it's also important to know that slave codes were not necessarily this static thing. They didn't just enact these laws and the laws stayed the same the whole time. That's not really what took place. The slave codes were changing and they were being modified all the time. And they did that every time there became a new issue or there became a different need to control the movement or the behavior of enslaved persons in a different way. They would change the code to adapt to that. And you can see that really as you look through the laws as they changed in like the northern states, especially specifically in New York. So some people believe, like there's this idea that we're taught, I think, in American history as youth, that northern states were considered to be free states and the southern states were really the slave owning states. And that's really just not the case. And while there might not have been as much slave ownership in the northern states, each northern state actually had their own slave codes. And in fact, the colony of New York, which became the state of New York, had actually the strictest slave codes of all of the northern colonies. And they actually enacted their slave codes in 1702. And at the time of the Civil War, there was a line drawn between the northern free states and the southern slave states. But and at the time of the Civil War, none of the northern 19 states had actually had any slave codes left over. So we can see that there was a change in policy between what happened in New York in 1702 and at the time of the Civil War. But what we also have to take into account is that while what we consider to be the northern free states, they didn't have slave codes per se, they actually did have laws that governed slavery and enslaved persons. And those laws also affected the individual based on the color line. So if you were considered to be a Black person in a northern state, you were still governed by these laws that covered slavery and enslaved person. And at the time of the Civil War, we also saw that there were slave codes that were enacted by the federal laws that were regulating slavery. And those laws included an 1808 law that prohibited the import of enslaved persons from overseas, but it also included the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which required the free states or the northern states to create laws and enact laws and enforce those laws that they called that would require northern states to return enslaved persons back to southern states had they fled and made it to northern states. So while northern states at the time of the Civil War didn't really have slave codes, they did have laws that could require them to return enslaved persons. And it wasn't unheard of that a free person who had African heritage was forced back into slavery by somebody who is capturing enslaved persons and making a claim that person was actually an enslaved person. So we see slave codes acting not only on the southern states, but also through the federal government on the northern states as well. So while slave codes differed varied from city to city and state to state, and whether you lived in the North or the South, there were some very common themes that came out of the slave codes. And the first one was the restriction of movement. the restriction of movement was required in most regions, and it prohibited a slave or an enslaved person from being too far away from their plantation or where they were being housed. And in order for them to actually travel far distances, they would have to have a pass from their master, and it would have to be signed by their master. And some cities even required enslaved persons to wear tags that demarcated who they belonged to, and which plantation or which farm that they belonged on, to further restrict their movement and their identity. And they had to wear these tags at all times when they moved about. Another thing that they had was slave patrols, and slave patrols are something that was very problematic. When slave patrols, the entirety of the purpose of the slave patrol was to find and capture what they considered to be runaway slaved or enslaved people who had absconded from where they were supposed to be. And in slave dependent portions of North America, there was varying degrees of legal authority backed by patrols by plantation owners to other free whites to ensure that enslaved people were not free to move about at night, and generally to enforce the restrictions on slaves. So the whole purpose of the slave patrol was to restrict the movement and enforce the rules of the slave codes put on the behavior and the restrictions on enslaved persons. And what we think of as being the patrol, oftentimes these patrols were the judge, jury, and executioner of the sentences that they deemed of, and very emblematic of what we see in the brutality that we've come to know out of slavery in the United States, was enacted and perpetrated at the hands of these slave patrols. And what people don't realize is that today's modern policing system is derived specifically from the slave patrols. The slave patrols were the first municipal or policing system in the United States. And from the slave patrols developed this ideology of the municipal police department. And we see the effects that has had on the way that community policing is taking place today. So as other things that other restrictions that were common amongst the slave codes were the restriction against marriages. There was not a right to marry if you were an enslaved person, and in fact, you'd have to get the permission of your master or to be able to marry anybody. And it was enforced specifically to try to keep people from trying to switch their plantation or where they were being, by not providing the ability to intermarry between different plantations. So that was just another way to restrict movement and restrict the freedom and the family unit that could be created during the period of slavery. And the marriage between people of different races was also very strictly prohibited. So there was no ability to intermarry between the African Americans and the whites, or between the African Americans, even in the Native Americans, even though the indigenous people were enslaved at that time. There was many slave codes that prohibited the intermarriage between an African slave and an indigenous person that was found in the United States. There was a lot of prohibitions on gatherings. Most of the time, enslaved persons were not allowed to gather in large numbers on their plantation, and definitely not away from their plantation. This cut down on their ability to engage in communication and spreading information. It cut down on the ability to create community ties and familial ties or to be in contact with members of your family or people that had been maybe moved away from your plantation as they've been sold off or traded away. And this, it also prohibited worship. We know that many of the enslaved Africans were not Christians, and they were not able to gather and worship their true religion. Many of them were Muslims, and the inability to gather and in large groups prohibited that, and it was a way to sterilize the types of information that was being shared amongst the enslaved people, and also a way to keep social controls over them. We know that from time to time there was early on in during slavery there was enslaved persons could work and could generally operate like their own small markets, but as there became a need to cut down on commerce and information sharing and like further restrict movements to provide to really make sure that there was enough social controls in place to keep the white ruling class on top, it became and as slavery became more profitable, it became a more profitable endeavor to have an enslaved person working daily on the farm. Slave codes came and really began to restrict the ability of individuals to have trade and commerce, even amongst themselves. And in some places, if you wanted to have some type of commerce, they were required to be, enslaved persons would have to be wearing tags, and they'd have to be worn all the time and show that they had the right to work and engage in that specific type of work, whether it was being a blacksmith or a horseshoer or having a small market and trading in vegetables or seeds that they had produced on their own. And one of the things that is extra problematic was the restrictions on education. And we see restrictions on education playing itself out in several ways. It wasn't just restriction on education from knowing what's going on around you. Sometimes it was restrictions on religious education. You weren't enslaved persons weren't allowed to engage in any type of religious education. And also the restriction on reading. There was in many places a restriction on enslaved persons learning how to read or being seen reading or engaging in any type of reading. That plays itself out in several different ways as we go forward into modern history with a gap in education, and as we'll speak about later, when it comes to voter disenfranchisement, it plays itself out in a really big way after the Emancipation Proclamation and the ability for former enslaved Africans to be able to vote. It's utilized in a way that disenfranchises African men from their ability to vote. And another thing that we saw that's very common with regards to slave codes is the punishment and killing of slaves. Slave codes regulated very, very broadly how enslaved persons could be punished for any number of offenses, including running away or talking back or not working hard enough. And there really was this broad ability to inflict corporal and physical punishment on enslaved persons, and the accidental killing of a slave during a punishment was often no punishment for the person who had done that. It wasn't a crime. It actually did not prohibit the accidental killing of a slave if it was done during punishment. Additionally to these restrictions, there was a general inability for slaves to own, to be able to contract with amongst themselves or amongst other people that they were working with. They just didn't have the ability to create a contract or enforce it. They could not own property or land, which we can see later leads to like wealth inequality and also disenfranchisement of the vote. They could not defend themselves or their family against a white person's abuse or physical assault, no matter how unreasonable and or how dangerous or how life-threatening. They just didn't have the right to self-defense, no matter what was taking place against them. So we can see that overall, the aim of the slave codes, while we say that it was to restrict movement and to really prevent civil uprising of enslaved persons from being able to overtake their slavery and win and physically or win their freedom, it really is about like more than that. We can see that it had the effect of really restricting their lives in a way that made it really made it so that they were in a like in a lower position that than they should have been, and in a lower position than they would be able to come out of even after they realized that they had won their freedom. It put them in a way where we can see the systems of racism and the systems of oppression being put in place that will carry on for years and years and generations to come. It was really intended to disenfranchise them from their family, from their movement, from any form of commerce, any form of ability to provide or care for a family unit in a way that disenfranchised them for many generations. One of the things that was very common during the slave codes is that Black persons, whether they were enslaved or they were free, they did not have access to the courts. And they were not permitted to provide testimony in courts against a white person. And in many states, enslaved individuals had completely different court system than their white counterparts. So even if an enslaved person or a freed Black person wanted to take another free Black person to court, they would have a different system. They wouldn't go to the regular court system. And this led to very disparate outcomes and very different treatment of even the same legal issues that they had. However, enslaved Africans and free Africans alike could be subjected to criminal trial and punishment in the white man's court. So we can see how the court was used both as a shield for white people against African Americans in enforcing their rights, but also as a sword against African Americans to further oppress them, and that's something that we continue to see today through the criminal justice system. And one of the most problematic and notable cases in all of U.S. history, and it still stands as one of the worst judgments of the U.S. Supreme Court, which is the highest court in the land, is known as the Dred Scott case. And in 1857, the U.S. Supreme Court heard the case of a man named Dred Scott. And Dred Scott was sued John Sanford in court in a free state. And he had previously been, at the time he was enslaved by John Sanford. And there was a period of time where John Sanford had traveled with Dred Scott and his wife and children through the northern free states. And as a result of that, after John Sanford had engaged in a violent beating of Dred Scott and his wife and children, Dred Scott took an attorney and decided to sue for his freedom. He decided that he would sue for his freedom in a free state that he had lived in with Mr. Sanford. And his theory was that because he had lived there in that free state, that he was now a free man because the slavery was not permitted in that state, and therefore his family should be free. and also the beating and the abuse that he took from John Sanford following that period of time when he considered himself to be free was actionable, and he had a right to bring an assault charge against John Sanford. Originally, Mr. Scott had won his case, and then he lost again, and then the Supreme Court decided to hear it. And the Supreme Court made the unfortunate determination that had a very long-lasting effect through all of the civil rights litigation, up through things that we see, Plessy v. Ferguson, Brown v. Board of Education. This became a thorn in the side of people looking to move forward with court litigation around civil rights, because what the Supreme Court actually determined was that Dred Scott was not a U.S. citizen. And the reason he was not a U.S. citizen is because enslaved persons could not be citizens of the United States. And therefore, an enslaved person could not avail themselves of the protection of the court, because the laws were written for the protection of the citizens. In order to go to federal court, you have to be a citizen of the United States. If you want to sue at that time, you wanted to sue somebody else who was from a different state, you had to be citizens of different states. And Mr. Scott, the Supreme Court proffered, could not be a citizen of any state because he was an enslaved person, so he could not meet the jurisdiction requirement to be in court, and therefore he lost his case. And as I stated, this case becomes one of the most important cases in U.S. history for showing how wrong the U.S. Supreme Court can oftentimes make it. There had been a lot of, at this time, angst and discussion about how the courts would treat enslaved people, or it was intended to settle a dispute between basically the northern free states and the southern slave owning states regarding slave ownership and what the rights of people would be with regards to being found at different places. And all it did was make things worse, and it made things worse for generations of Supreme Court cases that came to follow it. So as I stated before, all of these things that we've discussed so far, they had long-lasting generational effects. The slave codes turned directly into the Black codes, right as slavery was abolished and the 13th Amendment was adopted. And the Black codes attempted to keep in place the caste system that was created, where whites were superior to Blacks, and to keep in place the social controls that would effectuate that white supremacy. Outside of the Black codes, there were many leftover remnants of the slave codes that we still see in effect today. The Black codes were an attempt to control the newly freed African Americans by barring them from engaging in certain occupations, from performing jury duty, from owning guns, from voting, and from other pursuits. And these are all things that we see still having an effect today, in how we view different things. At first, the U.S. Congress opposed the Black codes by enacting legislation called the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and 1875, and the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution. But by the time of the so-called Compromise of 1877, where they were trying to both appease the southern states and also grant civil rights to newly freed African Americans, civil rights for Blacks had eroded to an all-time low. As U.S. Congress and the Supreme Court and the Northeastern began to lose interest in this case, so it was no longer a big deal, and they were really losing interest in focusing on the rights of African Americans. And the slave codes, as we know them, really lived on to what's going to be called, be known as the Jim Crow era, or Jim Crow laws. And I'm not really going to talk too much about Jim Crow laws, because I believe one of our later sessions actually discusses Jim Crow in detail. So I'm going to leave that for that. But what I will say about Jim Crow laws, that they were just another form of discrimination that continued on generationally, that were derived from the early treatment of enslaved Africans as they came to the United States, and these laws were put in place. And sometimes we have this idea that if it's law, then it must be okay. But these codes and the Black codes and the Jim Crow laws are really an indication that just because something is law doesn't mean it's good. It doesn't mean that it's moral. It doesn't mean that it's ethical, and it doesn't mean that it's something that we should continue to rely on when we're making our daily judgments. And it really wasn't until there was successful challenging of the Jim Crow laws in the 1950s and the 60s that we really see some movement towards attempting to eradicate the generational oppression that has taken place. So some things that we saw left over that survived the slave codes, the Black codes, the Jim Crow law, and survived still through what we've known as the Civil Rights era are slave patrols. And as I said before, slave patrols were really the first instance of the authorized use of police force, and they were intended solely to control the conduct of enslaved persons of color, and to keep people safe from what they were claiming were violent Black persons. And it also led directly to the development of state militias that we see currently policing and engaging in violence against peaceful protesters around the country. We are currently in another form of a civil uprising looking for civil rights for minorities and African Americans. We're still engaged in this struggle to obtain civil rights, basic civil rights and basic human rights for African Americans as it pertains to anti-racism and policing and the systemic racism that we see in policing and in the police force that is derived specifically out of these slave patrols that were intended to do nothing but control the behavior and of Black and brown persons. And we see these militias and these police forces still engaging in the same types of brutality against African Americans now that we did when they were first enacted under these slave codes. So when we're speaking of systemic racism, that's one of the things that we're speaking of, and that's one of the things that's a remnant of these slave codes, which is why it's so important to learn about this issue. When we talk about what happened because of the restriction of movement and the inability to own land, we still see that as a generational issue that has contributed significantly to the condition of systemic oppression for African Americans in the United States. And it led directly to racially divided cities and counties and states. It's the redlining and housing, where there were certain areas previously that were only for whites only. The restriction of movement and the inability to own property led directly to that system. And we still see a lot of that now, even with racially segregated cities. Even the divide is clear in some places. It also has led into an inequality to housing prices and housing values that we see, especially in minority-owned neighborhoods, which contribute substantially to the wealth gap. It also contributes substantially to public funding via taxes being lower in minority-owned communities. And those taxes are used for things like public services, roads, infrastructure, and public schools, just to name a few things. So if we're valuing houses lower and the taxes are lower, then the money coming back into the community to take care of those basic necessities and public services are also going to be lower. So it continues to perpetrate this lack of services and lack of this income and wealth gap that we continue to see. Many of the slave codes led to disenfranchisement. And for people who may not be familiar with the term disenfranchisement has to do with voting. Right now, we see a lot of discussions around disenfranchisement of former felons. Fortunately, in Michigan, we don't have that issue. If you're convicted of a felony, but you're not currently incarcerated in a jail or a prison, you can vote. but a lot of these policies that were enacted under the slave codes led directly to disenfranchisement of African American and Black persons' votes. While the 14th Amendment was approved by Congress in 1866 and ratified in 1868, it granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, including the former slaves, and it guaranteed equal protection under the laws to all citizens. And in 1870, Congress passed the law of the three so-called Reconstruction amendments. The 15th Amendment, which stated that voting rights could not be denied or abridged by on the basis of race or color, and or previous servitude. So former slaves were in fact eligible to vote. And while the 15th Amendment purported to give these rights to emancipated persons of color and emancipated former enslaved persons, some states, especially southern states, put a substantial barriers on the rights to vote. And the barriers that they put in place were made possible specifically because of the slave codes, which allowed for that. And certain like if we're talking about disenfranchisement of votes that came out of the slave codes, we had the inability to be educated if you were an enslaved person. And then when you are emancipated and now you should have the right to vote, but southern states put in a literacy test. So you would have to go and you'd have to read a formal statute. Sometimes, often, they were asked to read laws, which can be very complicated, even for people who are trained in reading laws. And then they would have to explain those laws to a white person who was the county clerk, who would then determine whether they were literate enough to vote. So we see the inability to read playing itself out in voter disenfranchisement, which is an important issue, because we know if we don't have the right to vote, then we don't have the right to set policy changes or to vote in or elect people who speak for us, and we'll be working to ensure that our rights are protected and our needs are met. So that's a very important issue. Other ways that we see the slave codes directly relating to voting issues is there might have been property requirements to vote. There were rules against with poll taxes. So if you were not a wealthy landowner and you weren't able to make money, you wouldn't be able to pay these poll taxes. And the poll taxes had to be paid for 2 years before you had the right to vote. So it was like a substantial burden. And if you weren't previously allowed to engage in commerce or own a business or own land or make money, how are you now expected to pay 2 years of poll taxes before you could vote? So those are ways that we've seen these laws playing out and going further. And also with Dred Scott, like if Dred Scott wasn't a citizen, many of the states enacted rules where your grandparents had to be eligible to vote. So if your grandparent wasn't eligible to vote, you weren't eligible to vote, and nobody's grandparent, right at the end of the term of slavery, had been eligible to vote. And Dred Scott sort of solidified that when it said that slaves at that time, enslaved persons, were not citizens, so they could not have the right to vote. So those are things that had to be overcome. And it really wasn't until 1965 when all of these voter disenfranchisement laws of the South had been overturned by the Voting Rights Act. That was 1965. At that time, there were still formerly enslaved persons who were alive. There were generations of individuals who came at the end of slavery and who maybe were not born into slavery, but were still being affected by these laws that that their grandparents were subjected to, that were now disenfranchising them of their right to vote. So we see that Congress has still been working to undo what had taken place during the slave code time. There's still currently undoing that. So there's still a lot of work to be done. There's still many effects of the slave codes that we're still seeing today. And we're hoping that we can can overcome this in our generation. And so with that, I would like to open the floor if we have any questions. I know that sometimes people have watched the other classes to see if maybe we want to have some questions.
Thank you very much, Sister Amy, for your valuable presentation. If any people who are on Facebook right now or YouTube like that pose a question in regards to slave codes, then please do. I want to stress a couple of points just to reiterate what Sister Amy went over. And one is that the statistics that relates to slave codes and the connection between the indigenous people, the so-called Native Americans, that in the Carolinas, especially South Carolina, that about a quarter of the enslaved people were actually indigenous people or Native Americans. They weren't Black Africans. And I think that's important for us to understand when we talk about the issue of systemic racism in America, its legacy effects, as well as discussions on reparations. When we're talking about the talk of reparations, and our talk about reparations should go beyond just simply the enslaved African Americans, but also in relationship to those indigenous people, Native Americans who were enslaved, who were never given monetary reparations. There's no real way of making a people whole that have been enslaved and had their families broken apart and disconnected. So that's one thing. The other issue is around slave codes and the wide-ranging effects in regards to blocking education, in particular, and the splitting up of families. And I would suggest that you watch a new movie that just came out this year, 2020. It's on Netflix. It's called Emperor. It's called Emperor, and it's about the life of Shields Green. I actually just watched it last week. And Shields Green was a runaway. He left the plantation that he was at, and he left from South Carolina to Virginia, and he joined Jim Brown, who was a white abolitionist, at the famous Harper's Ferry raid. The movie is not historically accurate in the way that it ended, but if you watch the movie up into the time when he went to Harper's Ferry, it's pretty accurate, but it will show you the extent of slave codes and this restriction. In fact, it's utter inhumanity and brutality. So that's something that you could watch. Again, it's called Emperor. And it talks about the life of Shields Green. And we'll also give you a little information about John Brown, if you all don't know about the white abolitionist John Brown. We'll give another minute or so for any questions, and if not, we will conclude. Again, we have, for more information on our classes and the upcoming schedules of classes, you can go to our website, which that is scrolling at the bottom. And our next class will kind of build upon what Sister Amy was discussing, in which CAIR Michigan Board President Haris Ahmed will be discussing the history of policing in America, which will, again, touch on this issue of slave codes and go into a little more depth about the systemic inequalities of how different communities have been policed in America. And this is all by design, by the way. And we should not say that the system of policing in America is a broken system. It's not a broken system. It's operating actually how it was designed from the very onset. So when we see certain things going on and how different communities are policed different ways, to incidences like Breonna Taylor, then we can see, if we study history, that these things taking place are actually not an accident at all. They are operating how they were designed to operate, and it's our job then to try to dismantle these systems so that we can perhaps build something better. Given there's no questions, do you have any closing comments, Sister Amy, before we conclude?
I agree with a lot of what you said. And when I first started looking into this information to prepare myself for this class today, it really became evident to me how many things from the time of slavery has carried over into what we see today. And it really is sort of mind-boggling to me that we have elected politicians who can sit up here and deny the idea that we have systems of oppression in place, that we have systemic racism, and that systemic racism has contributed to a lot of the inequalities that we see today. It's amazing to me because it is so clear when you study the history of the enslavement of persons, how the laws that affected that enslavement were carried over and over and over and over and over into generations. Even if you take 1865 to be the ability for the African Americans to actually fully gain the vote, with the inability for people to restrict their voting, we see today voter disenfranchisement taking place at high levels with regards to felons, with regards to the people actually oppressing the vote by not allowing people to vote. And I just really wish more people would engage in this type of discussion and this type of discovery, because it's clear once you look at our history what systemic racism is and how it has contributed to much of the inequality that we see today.
Thank you. And with that, we will conclude with this class. And for those of you who are watching, please share this particular class as well as the class schedule with others who you know, especially those within our community who are going around right now justifying the misconduct of the police, which unfortunately we know some people in our community, including community leaders, some of them who are justifying some of the outrageous actions by law enforcement. With that, we will conclude. Jum'ah Mubarakah alaykum. May Allah grant you all a blessed night and day of Jum'ah. And please keep CAIR Michigan's board members and staffers in your sincere supplications tonight and tomorrow. And may Almighty Allah Azza wa Jal bless and protect you all. And may He protect this country from harm. And may He protect the ummah of our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam.